we're joined now by Mr. Maher Nicolas Firzli, the director of the EU-ASEAN Center, an expert on global economic governance and the strategic realignments reshaping Eurasia and the Indo-Pacific. Welcome, Mr. Firzli, and thank you so much for joining me here today at In Focus.
My pleasure.
Mr. Maher, how do you explain the ideological inversion where many liberals they now champion military power while the right grows more isolationist?
Yes, it's a paradox. It's a paradox. It's a strange paradox. And it was, to a large extent, invisible, right? So we had that paradox, but it was not obvious because both big parties, the Republicans on the right and the Democrats on the left, were controlled by similarly motivated foreign policy, national security intellectuals. So inside the Democratic Party, they were called liberal hawks, as-suqur liberaliyin. And inside the Republican Party, they were called neocons, neoconservative. But in reality, when it comes to military deployment, foreign wars, pro-NATO, pro-Israel, blah, 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 they were very similar. And that's why people in the Middle East or Europe were shocked when they saw, when she was a senator, when she was, I think, for 9 years or 10 years, a US senator, Hillary Clinton was very close to Dick Cheney and George Bush on foreign policy and military affairs. And many people in Europe and the Middle East said, oh, it doesn't make sense. But it makes sense if you know the intellectual history of the Democratic Party. And for many years, that party was very hawkish, hence the term liberal hawks. And, it's a nice coincidence in a way. The two events are not connected, but sometimes in history and geopolitics, you have two disconnected events which happen at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. So Mamdani won a surprise victory in New York 6 or 7 days ago, and completely disconnected, 3 days ago or 2 days ago, Nancy Pelosi announced that she would retire in the coming days. And it's very interesting as a character, Nancy Pelosi, the all-powerful leader of the Democratic Party in the House. Why is it interesting? She's the daughter of Thomas D'Alessandro. And you could say back in the 1930s and 1940s, Thomas D'Alessandro was one of the original liberal hawks. It's interesting. His daughter controlled, to a large extent, the Democratic Party until 2 days ago. That's really fascinating. And so, to make a long story short, why a big chunk of the Democratic Party was pro-war, pro-NATO, and pro-Israel, it had to do with the Cold War. In 1945, not only Soviet Russia controlled half of Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, but the communist parties in Italy and Greece were very strong, right? And many of the Democrat voters in the big cities like Baltimore or New York or San Francisco were white ethnics. What does it mean, white ethnics? It means Italian American, Polish American, Greek American, Irish American. And these people, knowing that the Communist Party was very strong, in Rome, Milan, Athens, were afraid for their home country, right? They were afraid for their home country being taken over. And for the Polish people of, the Midwest and Pennsylvania, their country had already been invaded. And so naturally, left-wing working class voters of Irish, Italian, Greek origin, they became naturally liberal hawks. It's not the only reason. The other reason is the elite, the rich Harvard and Princeton educated liberals back in the 1940s and 50s, they hated communism even more than the Republicans, which sounds strange. So they were the elite, the blonde, blue-eyed, Anglo-Saxon elite, center-left at home, but abroad, very pro-NATO and very pro-Israel.
Sir, to what extent is this shift, do you think, driven by Trump's conflict with the Pentagon rather than a principled ideological change?
So here, the liberal press, right? The liberal hawkish press. So typically that would be, the New York Times, for example, the Washington Post, the Atlantic magazine. So these guys, they're liberal hawks and they really hate Trump. So of course, they're framing the debate. They're exaggerating the debate. And they're saying, there is a crisis brewing inside the Pentagon. I think it's wildly exaggerated, but it's linked to Trump differently. So it has nothing to do with Trump firing a few incompetent generals and admirals, but it's linked to Trump indirectly, because what did Trump do to gain power and to enter the White House 9 months ago? The second Trump presidency, once again, is very different from the first one, because in the second Trump presidency, he was able to get rid of the neocons inside his own party, people like John Bolton, right? And now he's really Trump. Now he's really an American nationalist, a neo-Nixonian American nationalist to the full, which he was unable to do 8 years ago, because in his first term, we had many senators and MPs on Capitol Hill who were neocons. So to make a long story short, the left, the new left, is watching the Republicans, right? And they say, oh my God, we thought it was impossible to get rid of the pro-NATO, pro-Israel, neocon establishment inside the Republican Party. Trump was able to do it. He eviscerated them. He eliminated them to a large extent. Why can't we, the Democrats, do the same inside our own party? So now you have many grassroots leaders, not only Ocasio-Cortez and Mamdani in New York. You have many trade union leaders, labor organizers, municipal councilors across America. They're saying, let's do the same. Let's get rid of our own quote unquote evil bastards. Let's get rid of the liberal hawkish Nancy Pelosi, Clinton, Biden elite inside our own party. So that's very interesting, because even though they don't like Trump politically, they are taking part of their inspiration from Trump.
If you can explain to us a little bit, Mr. Firzli, now Ukraine is framed as a clear moral struggle, whereas Gaza is framed as complex. What does this double standard tell us about the liberal hawk foreign policy?
Yeah, in my opinion, it's not about good or bad.
Why do we see this double standards, basically?
Yeah. But there is a double standard. So there is an unjust, in my personal opinion, there is a very unfair, unjust double standard.
Yes.
But being a realist, or being myself a neo-realist, I don't view it in moral terms. But why is there a double standard? Because of course, if you look, ceteris paribus, so like for like, relative to the size of Ukraine,
okay,
in percentage term, right, and relative to the size of Russia, comparing apples and apples, not apples and oranges. Of course, the Israeli armed forces, they killed many more civilians in Khan Yunis, Gaza, Beit Lahem, Ramallah, Al-Arih, Jericho, than, ceteris paribus, the Russians did in eastern Ukraine, right? So then in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, across the world, they're saying, oh my God, there is a double standard.
But sir, this still doesn't explain the double standards. Why do we have the double standards in these two, the Ukraine and Gaza we're seeing?
Because it's due to history. You remember, what I said, Thomas D'Alessandro, Nancy Pelosi's father, blah, blah, blah. Why history? Because when the Democrat Party was reorganized in 1945-46, the white ethnics, the Polish, the Italian, the Irish, the Greeks, to build a coalition, they had to find allies, right? And so they wanted America to fight communism in Rome, Napoli, Warsaw, and Athens. And you had many Jewish voters. And back then, 95% of American Jewish voters, it's a lot, right? 95%, they voted for the Democratic Party, and they hated the Republican Party back then because they thought the Republicans were racist and pro-German or whatever. And so to build a coalition, the Italian, Polish, Greek MPs or senators, they told the Jewish senators, look, we'll back you on Israel if you back us for NATO and against communism. So it's an alliance of circumstance, right? So to build a coalition, a liberal, hawkish coalition,
Yes.
they had to bring together many interest groups. Another lobby or interest group is in Democrat majority states, you had many weapons factories, right? And after 1945, you had to justify keeping, the weapon factories on after the defeat of Germany. So having Russia or communism as a new boogeyman or enemy was good for them because you could justify building, weapons and missiles. And in many of these states, the majority of voters were actually Democrats, working class Democrats. They wanted to keep their job working for Raytheon or McDonnell Douglas and to build, military hardware. So they also wanted justification. So domestically in America, there was a domestic national alliance between different lobbies or different pressure group to support NATO and support Israel. And President Truman was the incarnation of that new liberal hawkish stance.
Well, Mr. Firzli, I'm going to come to my next question, which is also related to the American left hawk alignment. How does Europe, especially France, Germany, and Eastern Europe, view this new American left hawk alignment?
Well, they are afraid because in the ruling party, so inside the governing establishment, the elites in Berlin, Brussels, Paris, London, the conservative right is very much neocon. And the center left, like Emmanuel Macron, for example, they are very much liberal hawks, right?
Yes.
So they love Harry Truman, they love Nancy Pelosi, they love George Bush and Dick Cheney. So they're horrified in Europe after Trump eliminated the neocons inside the Republican Party. Now they're even more horrified because the likes of AOC and Mamdani and their many disciples want to eliminate the pro-NATO, pro-Israel liberal hawks inside the Democratic National Committee. Yep. So really, this is frightening Europe, and many in Europe are lost, and they're telling themselves that they no longer understand America because they don't want to understand America.
But do you think the new left inside the Democratic Party could actually eventually challenge and displace the liberal hawks, similar to how Trump may have displaced the neoconservatives in the GOP?
Yes, I think yes. I think it will take a little more time and more effort. So, what Trump did was not easy. And look, it took him 10 years. Right? So, and Trump is a very hard fighter, very dedicated, very focused, animal. But even someone extraordinary like Trump, it took him, 10 years and a lot of bruises to reach that point, right? It will happen inside the Democratic Party, starting in the big cities. So starting, for example, New York, Chicago, Milwaukee, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Already at municipal level, we're seeing the old bourgeois, upper class, rich Democrats, we're seeing them collapse. And when they lose the big cities, after they lose, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, they already lost New York, and they will soon lose, Philadelphia. Then comes what? Then comes the state. And when they lose the state, they lose all the rest.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. Firzli, the director of the EU-ASEAN Center, for this insightful and structured analysis.